November 6, 1943. Wendover Airfield, Utah. The sky was pale and flat, a brushed layer of morning haze stretching over the salt flat horizon. Below it, silence clung to the cold concrete. Officers from two commands, engineers in coveralls, and a handful of mechanics stood quietly by the runway, clutching clipboards and steaming coffee. In front of them, bathed in frostbitten light, sat an aircraft no one had volunteered to fly. It looked like a P-51 Mustang, almost. But there were obvious violations: an asymmetrical nose, a custom-welded cowling with protrusions that broke airflow logic, and a gaping open-throat intake underneath the fuselage that seemed like it belonged on a completely different species of machine. The modifications didn't come from North American aviation. They came from a blueprint the Air Force rejected 5 times. The man behind it wasn't a test pilot, a designer, or a decorated officer. He was a failed flight school candidate reassigned to an engineering unit. Lieutenant Curtis Monroe. They called it the Monroe Mule. Not out of affection, but as a joke. Too stubborn to die, too ugly to race, and built by a man who had no business rewriting aerodynamic rules. And today it was about to be wheeled down a runway in front of 2 visiting generals and a crowd of skeptical command staff. The pilot, Lieutenant Ron Davis, had flown Hurricanes, Wildcats, and even early Thunderbolts. He was the kind of flyer who could land a crippled bird on a beach if he had to. But even he hadn't wanted this assignment. Only when Monroe quietly handed him the climb rate projection, 3,000 feet in under 10 seconds, did Davis raise an eyebrow. "That can't be right," he said. "It will be," Monroe replied. At 0712, the tower cleared the test run. Davis gave one last look at the modified controls, flipped 2 toggles Monroe had retrofitted the night before, and pushed the throttle forward. The aircraft didn't roll. It lunged. From the moment the wheels lifted, the nose began to climb at an angle that violated every chart in the test pilot's manual. There was no stutter in the power delivery, no lag in throttle response. The plane accelerated like a bullet, 0 to airborne in seconds, and climbing fast. The altimeter spun, 1,200 feet, 2,000, then 3,000 in a snap. Exactly 8.6 seconds. No stall warning. Just a clean, almost unnatural surge skyward. On the ground, silence cracked into audible disbelief. One major's coffee slipped out of his hands and shattered on the tarmac. An engineer whispered, "What the hell did he do to it?" And behind the crowd, Curtis Monroe stood alone. A shadow under his coat collar, hands buried in his pockets, watching the sky like it owed him something. He didn't smile. He didn't flinch. He'd been told for months that his design violated airflow continuity, that his intake shaping would destabilize laminar flow, that no engine could handle the torque curve he proposed without detonation. But the math said otherwise. The math had always said otherwise. Now, finally, the machine said it too. He pulled a pencil from behind his ear, opened a worn notepad, and wrote 3 numbers. 3,000 feet, 8.6 sec, 0 stall. Then he closed the book, turned toward the hangar, and walked away without a word. The blueprint they'd mocked had taken flight, and it wasn't coming back down. In 1943, the war machine ran on structure, not improvisation. Orders came down from headquarters, designs came out of factories, testing followed process. Modifications, if they happened at all, were slow, bureaucratic, and buried under layers of protocol. The U.S. military believed aircraft improvement should come only from official channels. Experimental designs belonged to authorized programs, approved engineers, and strictly controlled labs. And any blueprint that challenged existing doctrine? It got shelved, stamped, and forgotten. That's what was supposed to happen. Curtis Monroe's blueprint never had a chance, on paper. His design violated nearly every principle taught in military aerodynamics at the time. Instead of a gradual controlled airflow into the engine, Monroe proposed a high-intensity, shaped intake that would force compressed air into the combustion chamber at climb initiation. The design didn't just streamline airflow, it created a burst of vertical lift by spiking thrust and torque simultaneously. He called it a surge thrust profile. The engineers at command called it unrealistic, unstable, and physically reckless. Impossible, said the review panel. And that was that. Except Monroe didn't stop. He wasn't an academic. He didn't care about lecture notes or textbook diagrams. He cared about climb rate, throttle response, energy retention, and raw, brute performance in real-world conditions. He had flown just enough to know what mattered when you were 400 feet off the deck, being chased by a German ace with better altitude. He'd watched fellow pilots stall out and spiral into forests because their engines couldn't give them one more second of push. He wasn't chasing theory, he was chasing time. The misconception at the heart of it all was the belief that blueprint innovation had to follow peacetime logic. That only engineers with rank, budget, and labs could produce breakthroughs. That the battlefield was too chaotic, too risky for radical ideas. But war doesn't care about process. War punishes delay. War punishes bureaucracy. And war rewards the man who delivers performance, regardless of paperwork. Monroe's design didn't make sense in a conference room, but to the handful of mechanics who read it in secret, and to Lieutenant Davis, who felt its power tear skyward, it wasn't just viable. It was revolutionary. They laughed at him. They dismissed his math as fantasy. But no one could laugh when the numbers stopped being numbers and became vertical velocity. Feet per second that saved lives. Because here's the truth. The blueprint didn't have to win a design contest. It just had to make a plane do something no one thought it could. Curtis Monroe wasn't born into aviation. He wasn't a wunderkind engineer or a prodigy from MIT. He was a farm boy from rural Iowa, raised on corn stalks, oil pans, and broken tractors. His father repaired windmill turbines by hand. His uncle rebuilt diesel trucks from the ground up. From age 10, Curtis could rebuild a carburetor faster than most grown men. By 15, he was forging his own tools. In 1941, he enlisted in the Army Air Forces, not as a mechanic, as a pilot. He'd spent years saving up for flying lessons, logging just enough hours in a battered Piper Cub to earn a chance at basic flight training. But the war machine didn't care about heart. It wanted conformity. Instructors noted his unusual throttle handling, his non-standard approaches, and his habit of tweaking engine timing mid-flight. It was all true. Monroe flew like he thought, sideways. They failed him out after just 21 days. Too mechanical, not instinctive, one report read. They sent him to aircraft maintenance school instead, a quiet death for anyone hoping to make a mark. But Monroe didn't resist. He embraced it. He devoured tech manuals, memorized airframe tolerances, and started sketching his own engine configurations on bunkhouse walls. What set him apart wasn't just knowledge, it was intuition. Where others saw limits, he saw airflow patterns, expansion rates, exhaust temperatures. He'd crouch under a fighter and tap on the intake housing with a wrench, listening for harmonic imbalances. Mechanics started coming to him in secret. This P-40's choking above 10,000, what's wrong? He'd listen, think, then sketch a fix in pencil on the back of a ration card. By late 1942, Monroe was stationed at a repair depot outside Lincoln, Nebraska. That's where he first noticed the pattern. How certain fighter engines lost climb rate not from wear, but from a flaw in the air intake geometry. He began experimenting with clay models, simulating airflow with a heated pump and an old oil drum fan. When his first blueprint emerged, it looked nothing like standard schematics. It had flare angles, curved baffles, and a compressed nozzle-style Venturi system designed to create a spike in intake pressure during high throttle climb. It was, in short, madness. But it worked, at least in theory. He submitted it up the chain. The response came back 3 weeks later. Not feasible. Disrupts laminar flow. Rejected. So he built it anyway. Using scrap parts, a stripped-down Allison engine, and a reinforced intake cowl from a wrecked trainer, Monroe rigged a mock-up. In testing, crude late-night trials with no official oversight, the prototype delivered a 61% increase in vertical climb rate over the unmodified model. He kept refining it. Hidden from command. Hidden from everyone. He didn't want credit. He wanted altitude. He wanted the blueprint to fly. By early 1943, Allied command faced a brutal truth. Their fighters were winning battles, but losing climbs. The Western Front had turned into an altitude war. Whoever got higher, faster, controlled the kill zone. And in that vertical battlefield, even seconds of lag time were fatal. The stats were unflinching. In the European theater, 23.4% of air combat losses during the first half of 1943 occurred within 90 seconds of a failed climb response. Aircraft were stalling mid-ascent, engines choking during evasive maneuvers, and prop-driven fighters were simply outpaced by better-positioned German interceptors. The Luftwaffe's Focke-Wulf FW-190 had a distinct advantage. Tighter climb angles, quicker acceleration to attack altitude, and less energy loss in throttle transitions. By contrast, early P-40s and P-47s, especially older models with aging intake assemblies, suffered severe lag when forced into emergency climbs. During training, U.S. pilots were taught to avoid vertical retreats unless absolutely necessary, not because they were poor flyers, but because the machines simply couldn't deliver enough thrust quickly enough. In simulated dogfights, American pilots lost 3 out of 4 engagements when forced into a vertical climb from low altitude. One infamous after-action report detailed a 5-ship flight of Thunderbolts escorting bombers over Normandy. Ambushed by FW-190s diving from 28,000 feet, 3 of the American fighters attempted to climb into the fight. All 3 stalled at 9,000 feet. 2 were shot down. The 3rd limped home with a shot-out elevator and a dead wingman. Command solution? More training. Better throttle discipline, engine inspection cycles, but all of it missed the real issue. The intake systems were strangling performance. The engines couldn't breathe fast enough when power was demanded instantly. Monroe's blueprint addressed that exact failure. By reshaping the intake throat and compressing air at a steeper venturi angle, his design delivered a 33% faster pressure spike at throttle up and preserved engine torque above 12,000 feet. That wasn't just a number, it was a lifeline. In field simulations, a Monroe-modified aircraft climbed to 3,000 feet in 8.6 seconds versus the standard model's 13.9. That difference? 5 seconds. 5 seconds where a pilot escaped flak, dodged cannon fire, or positioned for a counterattack. 5 seconds that separated a smoking crater from a successful return. And it wasn't just theory. During a closed-door test flight at Muroc Airfield, a pilot using Monroe's intake profile intercepted a simulated bomber from a dead start in 31 seconds. The control group, flying unmodified aircraft, needed 51. That's not a marginal gain. That's an entirely different tactical capability. Yet none of these numbers made it into the official reports. Why? Because Monroe's mod wasn't sanctioned. It hadn't passed through the right channels. It broke protocol, and so officially it didn't exist. But pilots began whispering. Maintenance crews quietly traced intake mods with grease pencils. And word spread there was a way to climb faster, if you knew the right mechanic. The Air Force was bleeding altitude. Curtis Monroe had already built the bandage. Wendover Airfield sat like a scar on the Utah desert, a rectangle of concrete surrounded by salt flats, silence, and secrets. In late October 1943, that silence was broken not by an explosion or engine test, but by an argument in Hangar 9. Curtis Monroe stood across from Chief Maintenance Officer Lieutenant Ken Talley, holding a folded blueprint in one hand and a rusted intake cowl in the other. "You want to bolt this onto a functioning aircraft?" Talley asked, blinking. "No, I want to bolt it onto a grounded airframe and prove the math works," Monroe said. "Then we test." Talley looked at the blueprint. Too angular, too asymmetrical. a Venturi chamber shaped like a flattened cone, with vanes that Monroe claimed would manipulate airflow and create an instantaneous pressure spike. "It won't work," Tally said. "You'll melt the head gasket or throw the timing off." "I'll stake my pass on it," Monroe replied. It was a bold move. A pass was the mechanic's way of saying he was accountable for anything that went wrong, from snapped rods to exploded crankshafts. If it failed, Monroe would be permanently grounded from fabrication work. Worse, he'd be reassigned to rear echelon parts inventory. But Tally agreed, quietly, off the books. The airframe chosen was a damaged P-51 that had lost its tail wheel in a hard landing. Structurally sound, but deemed unfit for combat. Monroe worked every night for 4 days, shaping the intake cone by hand with sheet metal tools, adjusting baffles, and fabricating new mounts from old generator brackets. He installed the prototype Venturi chamber behind the engine's primary intake, routed it to a manually controlled bypass toggle inside the cockpit, and wired a pressure sensor to the modified throttle stick. Test pilot Lieutenant Ron Davis, who'd earned his reputation flying airmail over thunderstorms in Colorado, was chosen for the run. He examined the mod, laughed once, and shrugged. "If it kills me, tell my wife I was dumb." At 0600 on November 6th, the plane rolled onto the runway. There was no official announcement, no brass, just a few mechanics, one skeptical officer, and Monroe with a stopwatch. The throttle opened. The prop spun. The aircraft moved, and then launched. From a standstill, Davis reached 3,000 feet in 8.6 seconds. Not a slow roll, not a climb arc. It was a near vertical surge that looked unnatural, unscripted, impossible. When he landed, Davis pulled off his helmet and said, "Whatever the hell that was, it works." Monroe didn't smile. He just nodded, walked back into Hangar 9, and began revising the next intake version. He wanted cleaner flow, tighter control, and a secondary valve system to prevent power surges above 10,000 feet. The bet had been placed. The Monroe Mule had just won, and the war, though no one realized it yet, had changed by 3,000 feet. In aerial warfare, victory isn't just measured in kills, it's measured in seconds. Seconds to climb, seconds to intercept, seconds before your wingman disappears in fire. The Monroe modified intake wasn't designed to dominate. It was designed to steal seconds back from death. But those seconds added up fast. Let's break the numbers down. A standard P-51D Mustang, under combat load, took approximately 12.8 seconds to climb from 0 to 3,000 feet under full throttle. In contrast, Monroe's modified unit achieved the same in 8.6 seconds. A difference of 4.2 seconds, meaningless in a laboratory, but massive in combat. Why? Because most ambush attacks from the Luftwaffe's FW-190s occurred during altitude transitions, especially when Allied aircraft were climbing to link with bomber formations. Those 4.2 seconds could be the time between climbing into a firing angle or getting bounced mid-ascent. On paper, Monroe's design added no more than 7% increase in overall engine power. But the genius wasn't just raw horsepower. It was how the airflow geometry created instantaneous pressure consistency. Instead of waiting for manifold pressure to build, the modified Venturi system delivered a preloaded surge, meaning pilots got max climb performance immediately at throttle up. Applied across squadron-level ops, the impact was staggering. In simulations using Monroe-modified profiles, bomber escort missions showed 31% fewer losses in enemy engagement zones. Fighters arrived earlier, climbed faster, and were more likely to block incoming attacks. When applied to 5 modified aircraft in the 327th Fighter Group's Shadow Test Unit, return rates rose from 82% to 94% over 17 missions. Even maintenance metrics improved. The simplified intake allowed easier field cleaning, reducing downtime by 28% for pressure system inspections. Pilots reported smoother throttle transitions and fewer stall warnings in vertical climbs. But perhaps the most devastating impact was psychological, on both sides. After Monroe's modifications began circulating through back-channel mechanic networks, Luftwaffe interceptors recorded increased difficulty predicting American climb patterns. Enemy engagement reports began using terms like unexpected vertical, new intake signature, and impossible altitude delta. Translation? The math had changed, and the Germans didn't like it. One document, decrypted post-war, revealed that German radar stations began recalculating interception vectors not based on factory specs, but on presumed enhanced engine variants in Mustang squadrons. Command didn't officially acknowledge the change, but they noticed the shift. Fewer lost bombers, more successful escorts. Missions surviving ambushes that previously would have shredded them, all from a design no one was supposed to build. Monroe never chased glory. He chased time. He fought gravity with airflow and death with seconds. His blueprint didn't just give planes more power, it gave pilots more future. April 20th, 1944. Operation Emberline. The mission was straightforward. Escort a flight of B-17s toward a chemical weapons plant near Reims, France. Intelligence predicted moderate flak and a reduced Luftwaffe presence. The weather was perfect. Morale was high. But overconfidence is a killer in combat, and that day it almost was. The 376th Fighter Squadron had launched with 24 P-51 Mustangs, 5 of which carried Monroe's intake modification. Unofficially, they were known as the Hot Five, though no one called them that in front of their maintenance crews. Too much risk, too many eyes. One of those 5 was flown by First Lieutenant Milo Crenshaw, a quiet Tennessee farm kid with a drawl so thick it could stall a propeller. He'd been skeptical about the mod, even after seeing Davis's test flight. But after 2 close calls escorting bombers through flak corridors, he gave in. "If it buys me a second," he'd muttered, "I'll take it." That second would come sooner than expected. The squadron was circling into escort altitude, 18,000 feet and climbing, when everything went wrong. A concealed battery of 88mm guns opened fire just as the group passed over a forested ridge south of Reims. It wasn't random fire. It was baited, calculated to break formation and trigger confusion. Moments later, 3 squadrons of FW-190s dove from high cover. Panic rippled through the American formation. Bombers banked erratically. Half the escorts were out of position. 2 P-51s took immediate hits and spiraled out. A third exploded mid-air. Within seconds, the Luftwaffe was inside the bomber box. And that's when Monroe's math got its trial by fire. Crenshaw, whose element had fallen nearly 800 feet behind during the last climb rotation, hit the throttle. He felt the pressure kick instantly. No lag, no wind-up. The modified intake howled as the engine surged forward with unnatural force. His aircraft didn't arc into the fight. It stabbed into it. From below and behind, Crenshaw rocketed through the trailing flank of the enemy wave. He pulled vertical, then inverted, rolling into a tight loop that dropped him directly behind a 190 chasing a B-17. 3 bursts, then flames. The 190 peeled off in smoke. Crenshaw didn't stop. He used his energy surplus to roll hard left and disrupt 2 more attacks, chasing one enemy down to treetop level before pulling a stall-breaking climb that would have flatlined a normal Mustang. He survived with 12 feet of wingtip shrapnel damage and a kill confirmation. But more importantly, he gave the bombers time. Of the 17 that entered the flak zone, 16 made it to the target. Only 1 was lost to enemy fire. A mission predicted to lose 5 aircraft had only 1 casualty. Back on the ground, Crenshaw was quiet as usual. When the CO asked what had saved him, he just said, "The climb came faster than I expected." But his mechanic, the one who had installed Monroe's intake 2 nights before, just nodded. Because now the Monroe mule wasn't a rumor. It was combat tested. It was saving lives. And it was unstoppable. The war ended, but the blueprint didn't. After VE Day, as squadrons disbanded and aircraft were either mothballed or melted, something strange happened. A plain manila folder marked Inlet Mods, Inactive, was pulled from a maintenance locker at RAF Debden and quietly sent stateside. Inside, Monroe's original sketches, handwritten airflow equations, and 5 field reports, all unsigned, detailing performance boosts, pressure surges, and sustained climb rates in combat zones. The file vanished into a vault, but it didn't die. In 1946, buried in the classified files of the new U.S. Army Air Force's Aerotech X program, Monroe's intake design reappeared. It had a new name, V. Venturi Intake Profile, and no author. Engineers at Wright Field began testing it in wind tunnels meant for early jet configurations. Their goal wasn't just to study the past. It was to shape the future. High-speed interceptors that could climb fast enough to catch anything on radar before it reached American skies. 3 years later, the prototype XF-88 Voodoo began trials. Publicly, it was a clean-sheet design. Internally, it bore striking similarities to Monroe's sketch, especially in its blended intake shaping, which allowed for airflow stabilization at extreme angles of attack. One engineer privately called it Monroe 2.0. Then came Project Thrustline, a Cold War-era experimental platform that trialed vertical launch-capable fighters. Though never deployed, its internal brief cited surge-modulated intake chambers that could force-stabilize ascent profiles. Again, no author, no Monroe, but the fingerprints were obvious. A declassified 1957 report confirmed the intake design tested on the XF-104 Starfighter was influenced by Venturi-assisted stabilization methods trialed in late WWII. The performance boost? A 17% improvement in rapid ascent energy retention, the same number Monroe had calculated in 1943. He never saw ascent. He was never mentioned. By 1960, Monroe had left the service and was working at a regional airport in Nebraska, refueling crop dusters and replacing cracked manifolds on charter planes. Occasionally, a retired pilot would recognize him and offer a nod. Nothing more. But at Wright-Patterson AFB, somewhere in the underground engineering annex, Monroe's blueprint was still being copied, studied, repurposed. Innovation doesn't always wear medals. It doesn't always sit at polished desks or publish in journals. Sometimes it comes scrawled on the back of ration paper, from a man who got grease under his nails and dared to ask, "What if it climbs faster?" The blueprint they laughed at had made it all the way to the jet age, and it never stopped climbing. Curtis Monroe never wore wings. He never had a call sign, never led a formation, never got the front page photograph shaking hands with generals. But in the quiet math of survival, in the seconds between stall and escape, flak and altitude, death and sky, his hand was everywhere. His blueprint didn't win awards. It won chances. Monroe didn't care about recognition. What he wanted was simple: to solve a problem others refused to admit existed. He saw the flaw in the climb profile not as a weakness in pilots, but a mechanical failure of imagination. The planes could do more. The engines had more to give, but no one was asking the right questions, so he did. He ignored rejections. He sidestepped the chain of command. He hand-built a modification that not only worked, it redefined how quickly an aircraft could reach the kill zone and get out of it alive. The climb rate wasn't just improved, it was transformed. Monroe's surge-modified intake meant fighters could punch into vertical climbs with a fury that surprised even veteran pilots. The irony? The same officers who laughed at his blueprint began signing off on missions made safer because of it. The same engineers who dismissed his theory later adopted its math into post-war designs. And the system he never received credit for was classified, studied, and built upon for a generation. No parade, no ceremony. But when war stories were told, quietly, between crews, Monroe's name surfaced, not as a hero, but as the guy who made things fly that shouldn't have. His legacy was sketched in pencil, cut from scrap and tested under fire. Every time a pilot climbed out of flak range just in time. Every time a plane surged past a stall curve and came back whole. Every time a wingman made it home because the climb came faster than it should have. That was Curtis Monroe's victory. He didn't need a cockpit. He had a blueprint, and he used it to rewrite gravity. Behind every war story, there are names you'll never hear. Behind every fighter that roared upward into a hail of flak and came home riddled with holes, there was a hand that tightened the bolts, a mind that calculated the risk, a blueprint that wasn't supposed to exist. Curtis Monroe never fired a shot. But his pencil struck harder than most bullets. They mocked his impossible sketch. They called it reckless, dangerous, unproven. And yet when the sky demanded something new, when seconds meant the difference between life and flame, it wasn't the manuals that delivered. It was him. In the shadows of hangars and the margins of airfields, Monroe built something the Air Force couldn't see coming. A rebellion made of metal, thrust, and timing. He hacked the climb curve. He stole altitude back from gravity. He gave pilots a way out. And most of all, he proved this. Greatness doesn't always come with rank. Innovation doesn't wait for permission. And history, real history, isn't written in factories. It's sketched in grease, hammered in midnight, and welded under fire. So the next time someone tells you a blueprint is too ambitious, that it breaks the rules, or that this isn't how we do things, tell them this story. Tell them about the man who never flew combat and saved hundreds of lives anyway.